Chapter 4. The Call and the Road. Abram built altars the way other men built houses. Every place he stopped, every camp he made, every stretch of land where his flocks rested and his servants pitched their tents. Abram stacked stones and chose a lamb and made an offering. The smoke would rise in the morning air, and he'd stand beside it with his hands open and his face turned upward. And he'd call on the name of the Lord. I don't think he knew how rare that was. In all the settlements I'd surveyed, all the scattered nations I'd patrolled, the altars to the true God could be counted on my fingers. Humans built shrines to carved stone and shaped wood and painted clay. They poured out their devotion to gods the fallen had invented for them, gods who demanded and consumed and gave nothing back. Abram built altars to a God who had spoken to him once in the dark and promised him a future he couldn't see. That's faith. I didn't have a better word for it then, and I don't have one now. The land of Canaan was beautiful and corrupt. Green hills rolling south from Shechem, valleys thick with grass for the flocks, springs of water tucked into rocky places where the shade lasted most of the day. Abram moved through it slowly, learning its contours, stopping at Bethel and at Ai and at the places between, and everywhere he stopped he built an altar, marking the land the way an explorer marks a map, saying this is God's, and this, and this. But the Canaanites were already there. I'd seen their towns during the reconnaissance. Small kingdoms, walled compounds, tribal territories carved out of the hills and valleys. They worshipped their own gods, fertility cults mostly, the kind that twisted human desire into ritual and called it religion. The fallen were embedded among them, not as thick as in Ur but present, working, patient. The corruption was slower here but no less certain. Abram walked through it without confrontation. He didn't fight the Canaanites or challenge their worship or try to claim what God had promised. He pitched his tent, built his altar, moved on. A nomad in a land of settled people. A man with a promise and no proof. I traveled with him, closer than I'd been to any human since Eden. This was different from watching at a distance, from surveying settlements or patrolling boundaries. I was inside Abram's daily life now. I heard him talk to Sarai over the evening fire. Heard him negotiate with local chieftains for grazing rights. Heard him laugh at a joke one of his herdsmen told. A big, generous laugh that caught me off guard because I'd been thinking of him as a figure in God's plan rather than a man who found things funny. He found a lot of things funny. That was the first surprise. Abram had a humor about him that I hadn't expected. A willingness to see the absurdity of his own situation. 75 years old, walking through a foreign land. Married to a woman who couldn't have children. Told by God that he'd be the father of a great nation. He'd shake his head sometimes, standing at the edge of camp looking out over the empty hills, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has heard a very good joke and isn't sure if he's laughing because it's funny or because the alternative is despair. Sarai managed the household with a competence that held everything together. She directed the servants, organized the supplies, negotiated with the women of the local communities for goods Abram's camp couldn't produce. She did it all with a quiet authority that reminded me that she'd run a household in Ur. A real household in a real city, and now she was running a camp of tents and animals in a land she'd never seen before. And she hadn't complained once. Not where anyone could hear, anyway. I saw her face sometimes when she thought she was alone. At the well in the early morning, beside the cook fire late at night. The grief hadn't left, and the barrenness was still there. A wound that time wasn't healing because every month that passed was another answer. And the answer was always no. God had promised Abram a nation, descendants beyond any counting. Sarai was 65 years old. I did the math. Angels don't have children, but I understood the biology well enough to know that the math didn't work. It hadn't worked for decades, and every year that passed made it worse, not better. Lot was part of the camp. Abram's nephew, Haran's orphaned son, a young man with his own flocks and servants, and a way of looking at good land that told you he was already calculating its value. He wasn't a bad man, but he had a hunger in him that I recognized from other humans I'd observed. A desire for more that didn't necessarily care about the cost of getting it. He traveled with Abram because Abram was family and because Abram's God seemed to be making things work. And both of those reasons were genuine enough. But I noticed that Lot's eyes always went to the richest pasture, the fattest cattle, the towns where the markets were busiest. But for now, the household moved together. And the daily rhythms of nomadic life created a pattern that I found myself settling into with unexpected comfort. Morning prayers, Abram at his altar, the smoke rising, the flocks moving to pasture, the servants working, Sarai directing, Lot calculating, and the sun crossing the sky over a land that didn't belong to them yet but felt, somehow, like it was already theirs. The one cereal sent in the third week was different. I knew it before I saw it. The two that came with it crossed the perimeter at the east edge, the same gap they'd been testing for 6 nights. And I moved to intercept them the way I had every night before. Quick, mechanical, the kind of engagement that leaves no impression. But they didn't retreat the way they should have. They held. They kept me at the east edge, trading blows that meant nothing. And by the time I understood why, the real one was already inside the perimeter on the far side of the camp. It had come from the west, moving toward the center, toward the cluster of tents where Abram's household slept, toward Sarai's tent standing apart from the others with its flap tied against the wind. I left the two and ran. I should not have reached it in time. It had the distance, and I had a camp to cross. But it did something I didn't expect. It stopped. It turned to meet me, unhurried, the way you turn to deal with a small thing before going back to a large one. It had calculated that it could put me down and still reach her, and it was right about the time it would take. The blow caught me across the left side and put me into the dirt. Not a glancing hit, a considered one from something that had watched me for weeks and knew how I moved. I felt something give that did not give back. I got up anyway. It was already turning toward the tent again. Up close, it was larger than the ones Cyrielle usually sent. Broader through the shoulder. Its face carrying the specific damage of long hatred and longer memory. It had stood high before the fall. Higher than most. Whatever it had been then, it had kept the size and the strength of it, and it had spent the years since growing harder. In its hand, it carried something that was not quite a blade, more like an absence, a shaped negation, the kind of weapon that doesn't cut so much as unmake. I caught it before it took the second step. And for the first time in 3 weeks, I was fighting something I did not outmatch. The first exchange told me everything. I came in with the blade, and it met me with the thing in its hand. And where the two touched, there was no clash. No ring of edge on edge. The absence took the edge of my blade, not chipping it but taking it. The blade came away shorter than it went in. And what was gone was gone. Not broken off in the dirt somewhere, but unmade. As though that length of it had never been forged. I adjusted. You learn fast or you don't last, and I had lasted a long time. I stopped meeting the weapon and started working around it. Blade against the body, against the joints. The places the weapon could not cover. I landed 2 strikes. The first it ignored, but the second landed clean and staggered it. And for half a moment I thought I had found the rhythm of the thing. Then it caught my blade on purpose, took another hand's width of it, and hit me again in the same place on my left side. The something that had given way before gave further. The arm on that side stopped answering me. We had moved while we fought. That was the danger I had not been tracking. The give and take had walked us backwards step by step toward the tents, and I understood, with the blade half its length and my left side failing, that it had been steering the whole exchange. Every press, every feint, angled to put my back to Sarai's tent. It was 3 strides from her now. The blade was half gone, and my left arm had quit. So I threw what was left of the blade, not at the fallen, at the iron stake holding the windward corner of the tent, 2 feet to its left. The stub struck the stake, and the corner let go, and the whole north face came down. And Sarai woke with a sharp sound, startled, alive, close. It stopped, just for a moment, thrown by the collapse and the noise, and the woman suddenly awake behind it. I crossed the last strides inside that moment and took it to the ground. The fight became close and ugly. The 2 of us in the dirt with no room between us for the weapon. That was the only advantage I had left. Pressed in close, the unmaking edge had nothing to reach. So I kept us close. I got my good arm across its weapon wrist, pinned it into the dirt, and put everything I had on the lock. I did not try to beat it. I could not, and had known so since it took the first inch of my blade. I only had to keep it on the ground and away from her. I had no idea how long I could, and no reason to think anything would come to help me do it. I held anyway. The alternative was letting it stand up. Even that was more than I had left. Twice it nearly threw me off. The second time it worked the wrist half free, and the edge of the weapon passed close along my forearm. And the hair there was gone after, unmade, the skin beneath untouched and cold. I got the wrist back down, and I am not sure how. Then Michael was there. He did not strike it, and he did not have to. The fallen stopped fighting me. Every part of it turned toward the thing that had walked into the camp. And for the first time since it crossed the perimeter, it was not thinking about Sarai or about me. It was thinking about Michael, and it looked at him while Michael looked back. Whatever was between them had started long before this night, and it did not end here either. Then the fallen broke my hold and ran. Back past the perimeter. Out into the dark, and it did not slow where the others always turned to regroup. It just kept going. I stayed in the dirt, and Michael crouched beside me. "Your side," he said. It held, I said. It was an answer to a different question, but it was the one that mattered. "I'm putting a second angel on her tent." I nodded, and I did not argue, though 2 nights before I would have. I had thought one was enough, but I had been wrong by half a second. I lay there a while after he left and listened to the camp settle, with the servants murmuring in their sleep and the animals shifting. Sarai breathing on the other side of the fallen canvas, already pulling the tent back upright, muttering about the wind, never knowing. The promise had held by a thrown blade and a tent stake and the sound a woman makes when she wakes. That was the whole of the margin. That night, in that camp, that was all there was between the promise and the end of it. I wanted to believe the margin would always be there. That God built it into every crisis. Just enough and never less. But I had been on earth too long to believe that. Sometimes the margin is wide, sometimes it is a tent stake. Sometimes it is less. The famine started slowly. The rains didn't come when they should have. I'd been on earth long enough to know the patterns, the seasonal rhythms that God had built into the land. And this year the rhythm was wrong. The spring rains were thin. The summer was brutal, dry heat that cracked the ground and turned the green hills brown. The streams that had watered Abram's flocks shrank to trickles, then to mud, then to dust. Abram didn't panic, not at first. He moved the camp to lower ground where the water lasted longer. He rationed the grain stores. He sent servants to trade with the Canaanite towns for food while the prices were still reasonable. But the famine deepened. The Canaanite towns started closing their gates, holding their reserves for their own people. The livestock thinned. 2 calves died in 1 week. And the herdsmen started talking about whether God had brought them to this land to starve. I found myself angry at God. I want to be honest about that. Not doubting. I've never doubted God's goodness. But I was angry the way a soldier gets angry at a commander who sends him into territory without adequate provisions. God had called Abram out of Ur, out of a city with granaries and trade routes and a functioning economy. He'd led him to a land of promise and then let that land dry up and starve. Why? What was the point of calling a man to a land and then making the land uninhabitable? I brought this to Michael the next time he came. He stood at the edge of camp watching Abram count his diminishing stores, and I told him what I was thinking. The famine isn't punishment, Michael said. The land is broken. It's been broken since the curse, and rain fails, and harvests fail. This isn't God withholding, it's the world functioning as a fallen world functions. Then why bring him here? I asked. Why not call him to a land with reliable water? You're assuming the point is comfort, Michael said. I didn't have an answer for that. The point is faith, Michael said. What does Abram do when the promise looks impossible? That's what God is watching for, and that's what matters. Michael left, but the famine stayed. Abram made the decision on a night when the last water source near camp had gone dry. I was on the perimeter, driving off a fallen who'd been circling closer than usual, drawn by the desperation that hunger breeds in humans. When I returned, Abram was sitting by the dying fire with Lot, talking in low voices. Egypt, Abram said. There's food in Egypt. The Nile doesn't depend on rain. Lot nodded, having been thinking the same thing. The relief of a practical solution to a spiritual problem was plain on his face. The household can't survive another month here, Abram said. The animals are dying, the servants are afraid. When do we leave? Lot asked. Tomorrow, Abram said. Egypt, the most powerful nation on earth, was a kingdom built on the Nile's reliability, rich and sophisticated and thoroughly corrupted. The fallen had been building there for generations, woven through the temples and the courts and every place where humans decided who had power and who didn't. Egypt was Ur, multiplied by 10, a place where Abram's God was unknown and Abram's promise meant nothing. And Abram was walking into it because his flocks were dying and his servants were afraid. I reported to Michael. He was stationed above the camp, and his expression when I told him was the expression of someone hearing news they'd already expected. Egypt, Michael said. Should we stop him? I asked. Michael looked at me with patience that had edges to it. Can you stop him? He asked. No, I said. But could we, I don't know, redirect the famine? Open a spring? Send rain? Could God do those things? Michael said. Of course, I said. And if he chose not to? Michael asked. I stood in the silence of that question. God could end the famine with a word. He could open springs in the desert. He could send rain from a clear sky. He'd done all of those things before and would do them again. But he wasn't doing them now, and the reason he wasn't doing them wasn't mine to know. Then we protect him while he goes, I said, answering my own question. Even into Egypt. Even into Egypt. Michael confirmed. The journey south took weeks. The land got drier as they traveled, the famine's grip tightening with every mile. Abram's household stretched out along the road. A long line of humans and animals and loaded donkeys moving through a brown landscape toward the promise of water and grain. They looked like refugees, and they were refugees. I maintained the escort. Michael had reinforced the detail for the journey. 16 angels in rotating shifts. And the fallen tracked us from both flanks. Not attacking. Observing. Waiting. They knew where we were going, and I could feel their anticipation building the way you feel a storm gathering. Syriel's forces were thicker near the Egyptian border. The formations I recognized, his architecture. The corrupted systems he'd designed, running smoothly in every town we passed through. Shrines and markets and power structures all feeding each other in those closed loops of influence. We were walking into his territory. Abram changed as we got closer. I saw it happening over the course of days. A gradual shift in his posture and his expression that I'd been close enough to him now to recognize. The openness that characterized him in Canaan, the easy laugh, the morning prayers at the altar, all of it tightened as Egypt grew nearer. He prayed less, he talked less, and he watched the road ahead with an expression I'd seen on soldiers approaching enemy ground. Fear. Abram was afraid. Not of the famine. The famine was a problem with a solution, and the solution was Egypt's grain. He was afraid of Egypt itself, of its power, its king, its ability to take what it wanted. And I could see a calculation forming behind his eyes, a calculation born from fear, dressed as wisdom. 3 days from the border, he told Sarai. They were in their tent. I was on the perimeter, close enough to hear the low murmur of voices but not the words. Sarai's voice rose once, sharp, then fell. Then silence. A long silence. Then Abram spoke again, quiet and steady, and Sarai didn't answer. I didn't know what he'd said, not yet. I found out when we reached the border. Abram gathered the household. Lot, the senior servants, the herdsmen who managed the flocks. He stood in front of them with Sarai beside him, and Sarai's face was the face of a woman who had agreed to something she didn't want because the man she loved asked her to. When we enter Egypt, Abram said, "Tell them Sarai is my sister." The words hit me before I understood them. Sister, not wife. He was asking them to lie. Asking Sarai to lie about who she was to him, about what she meant, about the covenant that bound them. She is my father's daughter, Abram said, as if the half-truth made it less of a lie. If they think she's my wife, they'll kill me and take her. If they think she's my sister, they'll let me live. He was protecting himself, not her. He was trading her safety for his, wrapping the exchange in the language of family relationship so it sounded reasonable instead of what it was. Sarai stood beside him and said nothing. Her hands were still at her sides. Her face was composed. But her eyes were the eyes of the woman who had knelt at the stone in the courtyard in Ur, praying for a child, carrying a grief no one else could feel. She'd followed this man out of her home, across the wilderness, into a famine, on the strength of a voice he'd heard in the dark. And now he was asking her to become his shield. 3 weeks before I had lain in the dirt outside her tent with one good arm across a fallen's wrist, keeping it from getting through. Now her husband was opening the door himself. The fallen heard it, of course they did. They were close enough to hear every word, and their reaction rippled through the formations around our camp. Not attack, satisfaction. The grim satisfaction of watching an enemy do your work for you. Cyriel's voice carried from somewhere beyond the perimeter. Not shouting, speaking at a conversational volume that carried because he wanted me to hear it. He's going to lie, Kemuel, Cyriel said. Your chosen one, your hope. He's going to hand his wife to Pharaoh to save his own skin. And you can't stop him because that's how free will works. Isn't it? I gripped my blade and said nothing because he was right. I couldn't stop Abram from choosing fear. Couldn't stop him from lying. Couldn't protect Sarai from the consequences of her husband's cowardice without overriding the free will that God valued more than my frustration. Michael appeared beside me. He'd been monitoring from above, and his descent to my position told me the situation had shifted from concerning to critical. She cannot be taken, Michael said. His voice was steel. The promise runs through her. Whatever Abram does, whatever Pharaoh does, Sarai must be protected. And Abram? I said. Abram has made his choice, Michael said. We protect the promise. We protect her. Even from him? I said. The words came out harder than I intended. Michael looked at me. Especially from him, he said. Protection isn't conditional on perfect choices, Kemuel. It never has been. If God only protected the ones who didn't fail, he'd protect no one. Egypt rose from the desert the next morning. I'd seen it from the upper regions. A green ribbon along the Nile cutting through the brown waste on either side. From the ground it was overwhelming. Temples and monuments and cities that made look like a village. The Nile itself, wide and steady and utterly indifferent to the famine that had driven Abram here. Water that flowed because a river flowed, not because God sent rain. I understood why humans found it easier to worship the Nile than the God who made it. The Nile showed up every year. The Nile didn't make promises about children and then stay silent for decades. The Nile didn't call you out of your home and lead you to a land that starved you. The Nile just flowed, reliable, visible, and present. God was none of those things, not to human eyes, not in any way that made the math work. Abram crossed the border with his household. His lie in place. His wife beside him wearing the face of a sister, and his God somewhere above us, silent, watching a man he'd chosen walk into a trap of his own making. The fallen closed ranks behind us. And I followed, because whatever happened next, whatever Abram's fear cost him or Sarai or the promise, I'd been given my assignment, protect the promise and protect her. Even into Egypt, even through the lie, even when the man I'd started to care about was the one putting everything at risk. The hope I'd felt in Canaan, watching Abram build altars and call on God's name, hadn't died. But it was bleeding. Siriel's words echoed in the dark, and for the first time since Babel, I couldn't argue with them. He was going to lie, he was going to fail, and Sarai was going to pay for it. And I couldn't stop any of it.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.